Lesson 5.4, the proofs get longer, but they don't get harder. Let's say that again. They get longer, more steps, but they don't get harder. We have no new reasons to add to the list. They don't get any more complicated. And I'm going to say more about that as we go through this lesson. So first one, prove that angle RHV is congruent to angle RMV. Let's focus on what we have been given, because it's only from the given information that we can make any progress. Right? First, starting with any congruent things that we ought to mark in the diagram. Angle H, struggling to get my stylus working here. Angle HVR congruent to angle MVR. HVR congruent to angle MVR. That's those two angles right there, congruent to each other. OR bisects HRM. Again, some of you might draw a conclusion from that in your head and put congruent marks in the diagram, but unless you give the reason for those congruent marks in a separate step, you have not written a complete proof. You've not been thorough. And again, these proofs are not, the grading of these proofs is not entirely about, do I think you get the idea? Do I think you understand it? It's all in the thoroughness and the accuracy of the explanation. You've got to explain every step, okay? So the first thing that we could probably say from the bisecting of the angle is that if a segment bisects an angle, then it divides it into two congruent angles. Okay, so that's reason number 2. And the step that's going to go along with it had better be the statement of two congruent angles. That is the statement that goes along with it. Better be a statement about two congruent angles. Okay, this hypothesis connects to a previous statement. Now the new statement has to match this, two congruent angles, and it's got to be the right congruent angles. A lot of people made the mistake, a mistake on the quiz about this, and I'll say again what I said in class after that. The angle that's being bisected, angle HRM, see that vertex? The two new angles have to have the same vertex. Right? Here's the angle HRM that's being bisected. Right? And the two new angles also have to have the same vertex as that original one. And so those two new angles are angle HRV. We could also call it HRO. That would have to be congruent to angle MRV. We could also call that MRO. And now that we've stated those angles are congruent, we can put congruent angle marks in there. Okay. Now, I got to remind you of something I said recently, which is that every single proof from some point earlier on to the end of this unit, every single proof is going to require you to show at some point that there are congruent triangles in a diagram somewhere. Now, I did not ask you to prove here, not asking you to prove that triangles are congruent. I'm asking you to prove that angles are congruent, but I'm telling you, I'm just giving you this up front. It doesn't have to be this way. This is just a promise I'm making to you, that even if I don't ask you to prove specifically that triangles are congruent, you're not going to be able to prove what I'm asking you to prove unless you can get triangles congruent in your proof. Okay? So a good thing to get in the habit of, especially if I haven't asked you specifically to get congruent triangles, is to look at the things that I am asking you to get congruent. Angle RHV, where's that? That's here. Put a little question mark there. Don't mark it congruent to anything else. And RMV, we're trying to explain why those two angles with the question marks in them would have to be congruent. Put question marks alongside or inside those parts. Don't mark them congruent yet. We haven't proved them congruent yet, but put question marks by them so that your attention will be drawn to the triangles that those parts belong to. You see those two angles that I put those green question marks in? It's pretty clear what triangles those two angles belong to. And so we've got a pretty clear hint or direction to pursue here as far as let's get those two triangles congruent, triangle RHV and triangle RMV. And just by marking the given information and using the bisecting statement, we can see we already have two pairs of congruent parts in those triangles. But two pairs of congruent parts is never enough. I remind you, you cannot get congruent triangles unless you have this combination of congruent pairs of things or this combination or this combination. And right now, all we have is two pairs of congruent angles. Right? And this is the only reason for getting congruent triangles that includes two pairs of congruent angles. So it might seem like we need to get a pair of sides in between those angles congruent to each other. And in fact, we can. This side belongs to both triangles simultaneously. And so we can say that RV is congruent to RV, right? The side is congruent to itself. And the reason, the way I like you to write this as an if-then reason is if a side is shared by two triangles, then it is congruent to itself, right? It's not helpful to say a side is congruent to itself unless it's shared by two congruent triangles. Again, the truth is that every segment in the whole world is congruent to itself, but it's not helpful to say that about random segments. It's not helpful to say that about this segment over here or that one over there. It's really only helpful to say it about that segment there, because that segment belongs to the two triangles, so it acts like a pair. And now we can say that triangle RVH is congruent to triangle RVM. Okay, and the reason we would give here is if ASA, then triangles are congruent. All right. Now we haven't finished the proof yet, okay, because the proof asks us to explain why angle RHV, the green question mark triangle or angle here, is congruent to that one. And so now we're going to go back and use a reason that we haven't used much of in the last couple of lessons, but we used it several lessons ago and we used it a lot. And it is if triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. Okay. And so for that reason now, we can say, that's our reason number 5, and our statement number 5, supported by that reason, is that angle RHV is congruent to angle RMV. So this proof ran out to step 5. This is longer than any proof we have ever done so far. But again, I don't think that makes it harder or more complicated. Longer doesn't necessarily mean harder or more complicated, because the longerness is just more of the same reasons and statements that we've been using all along. It's just a few more. It's one more added to the proof, but there's nothing new in this proof. There's no reasons or statements that we haven't used before. Okay. And it's just like problems where you have to find angle measures. Again, sometimes you can find the angle measure that I've asked you for in one step. Sometimes it takes you 2 steps, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. It takes as many as it takes. And this one happens to take 4 steps of work after the information that I gave you. Okay. Now, that having been said, I know that for some students, longer proofs do get more difficult. I think at least one of the reasons, if not maybe the biggest reason, that a longer proof gets more difficult for them is because when they look at the given information, sometimes I find that I can tell students are trying to see all of the reasons and statements all at once. They're trying to figure out how they're going to get from the beginning of the proof all the way to the end of the proof before they start writing anything down. And in this particular proof, it's a lot of steps to get from the beginning to the end of the proof. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to be able to see all of the steps they're going to need all at once. And when they can't see the whole solution in their mind all at once, they feel stuck. And then they don't write anything down. And then they raise their hand and they go, Mr. Nortillo, I don't know how to do this. And I come by and I say, what do you mean you don't know how to do this? You didn't even mark these angles congruent. What do you mean you don't know how to do this? Don't you know what this means? What does it mean when a segment bisects an angle? You know what that means. Here's the metaphor or analogy that I like to use when I'm telling students about doing long proofs. Don't try to see the whole entire solution in your head all at once. Imagine you are in a very, very dark cave with one of those helmets on that has a little flashlight in front of it. That flashlight, if you're trying to find your way out of the cave, that flashlight might not show you the entire path that you need to take from where you're standing to the exit of the cave, but it shines some light on the space in front of you and enables you to take a step forward. And when you take a step forward, the helmet moves with you and the light moves with you. And the light now shines on some other step that you can take. So you take another step and the light moves. And every time you take a step, the light shines a little further, enabling you to take another step. And that's what doing long proofs is like. Don't try to see how you're going to get from the start to the finish all at once before you get started. Just focus on the information you have and what one next step that little information can take you to. Okay? That can be a really helpful discipline, okay, while you're doing these problems. Now, it does also help, I will acknowledge, it does also help to know where the finish line is, because again, that might help you focus on the triangles that you've got to get congruent, especially if there's more than two triangles in the picture. Okay. One more problem. We're trying to prove that these two segments are congruent. But again, you're going to have to get triangles congruent. Well, there's only two triangles in this picture. Okay. So let's mark the given information. Angle N is congruent to angle T. Right? And S is a midpoint of NT. Again, some of you might be in a hurry to mark, oh, see, that information means I can do this. Well, not until you write down the explanation for why that given statement allows you to do that, right? So yeah, NS is congruent to ST, but you better give me the reason, okay? And the reason is if a point is a midpoint of a segment, then it divides the segment into two congruent segments. Okay, so there's our step number 2. Again, I'm going to go in and do this thing I suggested in the first proof, put question marks by the things that we're trying to get congruent. Okay. But again, we're not going to be able to get them congruent unless we can get the triangles congruent. And right now, all we have in the triangles is one pair of congruent angles and one pair of congruent sides. We must get a third pair of congruent parts. All right? And hopefully you see them. We can say that angle ISN is congruent to angle WST. This angle congruent to this one. Why? Well, because they are vertical angles, right? And you've got to give me that explanation. If angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Okay. I remind you, every hypothesis of every reason needs to be connected to a previous statement, or in just two special cases, they can be connected to something that we see in the diagram. Okay. So everything's good so far. Now we need a step 4. Now we can say that the triangles are congruent. Triangle ISN congruent to triangle WST. And the reason for that is, what is it, ASA, SAS? It is ASA again. And triangles congruent. Trigonales. Let's try to fix that, shall we? Triangles. And then finally, reason number 5, if triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. Okay. And so step number 5, or statement number 5, would be IN congruent TW. Okay, and there's our reason number 5. And again, connecting ASA. Do we have ASA? Well, let's see. We got one pair of angles that was given. We have a pair of sides that we got here. I forgot the segment bar above that one. And then we got our second pair of angles here. And then if triangles are congruent, yeah, we had triangles congruent, right? You never, ever, ever use this reason until you have stated that triangles are congruent. You know, when we get to this lesson right here, this is where I start seeing students writing this reason. If triangles are congruent, their corresponding parts are congruent, but they have not written anywhere in the statement column that any triangles are congruent. And that's a problem. You can't use this reason if you don't already have a statement that's saying triangles are congruent. Okay. All right. So that's it. So don't forget about this vertical angles. Don't forget about a side being shared by 2. Oh, that said 12 triangles. Wow, that's a mistake. It's not being shared by 12 triangles. I didn't notice that when I typed it. It's being shared by 2. You will continue to need those 2 reasons. Those are the last 2 new reasons that we've learned about, and you'll continue to need them in most of the homework problems tonight. Not all of them, but most of them. There are fewer proofs in tonight's homework, but they are generally all longer than the ones you've done last time. So again, be prepared to put the time in to this homework. And in the next class meeting, we're going to have a group quiz. Okay? Get after it.